Hello everyone, today we talk about Saracen heraldry, which actually doesn't mean anything, nor Saracen nor heraldry in this context, as Saracen were the Saracens, right? It's just a classicistic way of stereotyping an enormous variety of peoples after the ancient Sinai tribe of the Sarcenoi, while today we'll be actually talking about Ayyubid and Mamluk Egypt, where we actually find this emblems, this rank, as we will define better, and not rank, probably rank in Arabic. We will see what that means. So there's a lot of striking phonetical coincidences, but the etymologies actually do not match. And also because heraldry, as a matter of fact, is it didn't exist in the Islamic world as in the Christian one, but also and especially it didn't exist in the Middle Ages, right? Heraldry is not a medieval thing. It's actually, as a proper subject, is a modern thing, and the Europeans definitely developed their own, emblem systems were quite complicated when categorizing towards the late Middle Ages in a way, but stayed very fluid. Well, the Islamic world had even less than that. Actually, this video would be dedicated to the history of the Crusades, but we will end up talking about late medieval Egypt, right? Because as we were saying before, this is actually the only place where we actually find what could resemble a heraldic system in the Islamic world that otherwise function in a quite different way. It's actually a big topic. I've been working here just very simply for making this video with the Encyclopedia of Islam, Meyer's study on the, in fact, this kind of on the rank that we'll see now, what it is, and collected a couple of other articles. And the picture we get from here is very fascinating, right? Because from one side there is a proper dynamic within the same, specifically the Islamic world, let's say the Mamluk one proper, right, and also the one of the of the Ayyubids in the function in which they were fundamentally something different from the Arabs, right, in this regard. Islamic emblems had been before this time very at least undergone through a series of important modifications. Since Umayyad times, Arabic symbolism had been quite conceptualized and idealized, right? And yet in this period, fundamentally there is that naturalistic in introduction, even in the symbolism, for example, of animals or of objects, right? That will correspond now to an ethnic injection, of course, in the Islamic world that had started centuries before, but that at this point takes over proper, because talking about the Mamluks, we're talking about essentially these peoples, actually various origins, but mostly of, especially for this rank thing of Kipchak Turks, right, and other like Circassians, etc. That, as you know, well developed in Egypt. The Ayyubids had been Kurdish basically, but even in here we shouldn't stay very dogmatic, because all these peoples were actually very influenced by the broader, I would say, culture of the steppes, as we actually had in Europe ourselves, in the sense that we like thinking of the Crusades, of drawing this sharp divide between the Christians and the Muslims. So if you actually look at their art and their symbolism, etc., there was a lot, an overwhelming lot in common, and this naturally stemmed from actually a very faraway past, right? Symbolism like the one of the hawk / the eagle, right? It was something you can find basically all over the Mediterranean basin since millennia before Christ, and the migration era definitely that in the Islamic world actually ended later, if you want, in some measure, at least compared to Western Europe, re-injected constantly this element of the steppes, from which fundamentally what we call chivalric also in Europe fundamentally stemmed from, since even here, since millennia, even before Christ. Think about the same Indo-Europeans that came from the Caucasian steppe. But aside from this, there is a lot, there would be a lot of background to give further, but let's simply begin by defining the rank in Persian. I don't think it's Arabic proper. if I'm not wrong, and I'm definitely not sure about a lot of things, because topics like this, like for example, so the one we made last winter about Islamic military music, are new to me, but at the same time, I think I get it, and I even in here in this, I mean, very essential, in outline, let's say. But what we found out, for example, from the musical point of view, and we talked about the Mamluks even in that video, is that definitely, for example, the Persian element here was overwhelmingly influential all over, the Islamic world, and having a great deal to do with this, pre-Islamic symbolism that permeated some of the most advanced areas of the world in this area at the time, and that had all this enormous legacy, in fact, of religious, philosophical, scientifical knowledge and systems and wisdoms that blended together under the influences of so many cultures all the time. So even talking just about Egypt here is, I think its part is misleading. We'll see, for example, the Khwarezmians actually had something similar to these emblems, right? So I suspect in general that. But in that sense, there is also the Turkic element that is actually very well represented even in the Steppish Matterland, we could say, with this, I don't know whether I can call it properly totemic, but definitely symbolical system that existed in those tribes, in those quite fluid groups that eventually the Mamluks even would be drawn from historically. So there are actually many question marks in here, because we don't really know much, as we will see now, about the topic itself, right? The studies about this stuff, I think, remained largely at Mayer, that identified in the sources that he knew something like only 50 references to these emblems in the Islamic world. I think at this time we arrived at around 70. So I don't think there's been a huge improvement. I've checked out, I think it was the article of an Egyptian guy that was writing in the last years, and he was basically quoting those same sources. So I don't, those same studies. So I get the impression that we can't really expand this, and probably we would find a lot more than just this. Not to say that we have been wrong, up to this point, completely in stating that the development of this quasi-heraldic system stems fundamentally from Mamluk Egypt, preferably, or maybe from the Ayyubids at very origins. But I find it difficult, if anything, also for comparison with some other cultures, that this system existed only in Egypt, right? That's probably where it was codified, and therefore we came to know it, right? Better also, and not just from documentary sources that, as far as I understand, are very, very few, but mostly from archaeology, from art, right? Even from textiles, things like these. And that's also very important because of the colors most of the times, because we I don't think we get much of from manuscripts in that sense either. But of course, behind the absence of sources, there is probably an historical reality back in the day. It was much more articulated than this, and in fact we can understand what's more from this. So the term rank, as we were saying before, means literally color / dye, right? And it was a term used in the Arabic sources in the Middle Ages to essentially designate the emblems and the insignia of the emirs and sultans, right? In Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. And that's where we mostly get the thing from, right? And already this prerogative is interesting, because, as you know, that the emir is fundamentally the equivalent, I don't know, the Christian baron, right, in the Frankish world, and the sultan is probably, there's a more abstract way of defining, this strong authoritative rulers, right? Sultan meaning authority or power, equivalent of a king. Right? It could be a king. The caliph being something different, comparable to the emperor, but even too excessive parallelisms with the Christian world shouldn't be stressed. But it's exactly from this distance that lays the difference probably between the development of this heraldic system in Europe and in the Islamic world, as fundamentally, as we've seen many times in Schwerpunkt, in Christianity and Islam, the political authority is conceived in a very different way, and fundamentally in the Islamic world, political authority is weaker, right? The Christians are much more supportive towards the earthly powers, right? They actually have a generally positive view of the same. And whereas in Islam, this is often seen, in a suspicious way. To even look at the term Malik, that is equivalent to this basically earthly prince that has in fact a negative acception proper, that it's as if someone was usurping God's power on earth. This mindset naturally is very blurred in many contexts, both in Christianity and Islam, but definitely in the Muslim world, this is reflected by a greater instability of power that has to do now with dynamics we can't repeat. There is an entire playlist about Islamic history if you want to check that out. I explain these things, and we'll have to explain them further. But the same Mamluks, are good representatives of what we're saying in many ways, as fundamentally these were, as dynasties of former slaves, right, or better serfs, right? Western historiography sometimes it's being too harsh in judging what slavery actually meant in this context. Mamluk as a serf was actually an extremely privileged person at some ranks of this society, and this is something that actually we had also in Christianity. Like if you look at the 10th century Europe, there were so many serfs that were way better off and richer and powerful than freemen under their lord's service. But in fact, in this, at this point, Europe had abandoned this thing, whereas in Islam it was still pretty alive. And Mamluk Egypt is actually a massive thing. Aside from the sheer dimensions of the dominion, it's also, with the Nile Valley, this wealthy and productive center of the Sunnah at this point, right? Fatimid Egypt, as you know, had been fundamentally a cradle of Shiism, right? Whereas these Mamluk dynasties eventually restored since the Ayyubids actually introduced officially the Sunnah once again, and they had restored the Sunnah. So even here there is a specific idea of rule that was different from the Shia world. But this is just for saying that development of heraldic symbolism, especially associated to a dynastic legitimacy of power, is something that it's not surprising actually to see in a weaker way in the Islamic world compared to Christianity, and especially to feudal Christianity. This has to do once again with a lot of other things. We could see differences, like for example even within the Byzantine Empire, that at this time actually was growing more kind of westernized by sheer mass of influence of the Frankish world in it. But the point is that the Muslims appear to be do not develop a proper feudalism as we know it, right? And there are certain areas that are fundamentally feudal, and we tend also to know less because they're less urbanized and more kind of less documented in a way. Persia, in some ways, it's like this, and it's in fact the area where I would like actually to see how the thing actually was, because if you are searching for quasi-heraldic systems, intuitively I would say look at Persia, because that's the place where chivalric feudal culture, from which also this broader amount of Turkic peoples had passed through in a way or another, by passing through, coming from the steppes into the Near East. But apparently it's not the case. And in fact, what we see actually in Mamluk Egypt is there is the Itkas system that is something similar to the Byzantine pronoia of the earlier times, that shows tendentially a greater control from central authority, with the entrusting a certain amount of land that rarely actually came back in the hands of the donors, but that were theoretically still not given in in a banal form, like in feudal Europe would happen, where there was this banal property that belonged to the private, no matter what, and the not even public authority basically could do much about it. So in this system, you don't find much of a dynasticization that takes an emblem and passes down to the various generations. And the ranks were fundamentally, mostly ad personam, right? And they were rarely retained by the heirs, and especially the ones that didn't pursue a military career, right? In this broader system. Now, Mamluk Egypt is also complicated to explain. We have to make a sound video on it. We have seen a bit of this from that video on the Mamluk army that explains a little bit this hierarchy and makes you understand in this regard the flexibility of the system, but also the attempt of developing through the royal Mamluks, especially this kind of more central army over the ones of the provinces that that were definitely decentralized and kind of growing private in that regard. So it's actually an enormous topic. This can't be probably even treated on YouTube at this point, at least aside from the fact that I don't know enough of it to be honest. I don't know Arabic, I don't know other local languages in here, but the point is that every form of generalization is dangerous. And you see even the geographical dimension of this all, that Egypt, Syria naturally were ruled by the Mamluks, but also the Al Jazeera, so the marshes, the Mesopotamia, especially western Iraq, were importantly influenced by this. We've seen this fairly well at the time of Baibars in the video on the Wafidiyya, right? So this kind of refugee / mercenaries coming from areas actually that we'll see today would re-inject this kind of more chivalric / feudal element of Mongolian and Turkic origin from Central Asia, also within the Mamluk Egypt, right? And Mamluk historians occasionally use the term rank for emblems in general, right? For example, the one of the merchants' guilds, right? Or, oddly, also the rank of Qassam, a Damascene rebel under the Fatimids, who lived even before the word was in common use, right? So, and even actually for some Bedouins of North Africa, some certain colors properly, as we have seen, the etymology is fundamentally this, and that definitely evidences the presence of a comparable system within even different times and spaces within the Islamic world from the Mamluk ones. So this is obvious, I would say, because emblems are, there is not a single people that does not use emblems for a military function, but even just for a political one. So it's rather to determine what function they had in the respective societies, right, and why they didn't develop as much in other places as in Mamluk Egypt. And for the rest, we don't have basically much other information on the term rank, right? Just in this fundamentally Ayyubid Mamluk context, right? And from the Ayyubid times, right, there is a number of references to the ranks. However, we do not have the iconographic evidence or the material evidence to which they correspond, right? So what they looked like, and that's why we know less. But eventually you see that even in that context, this thing existed. The fleur de lis, right, is associated, for example, to Nur al-Din, while the truncated bicephalic eagle in the Cairo citadel is usually attributed to Salah ad-Din, right? And these symbols, however, are not longer accepted as ranks proper, right, as they were, used at least in a different way from the others we'll see now. But that's, for example, already very fascinating, because as you understand, here we have two symbols that were used extensively also in the West. As a matter of fact, last week we made the video on the Battle of Bouvines of 1214, and we see that's the first time in which Philip II Augustus used the fleur de lis to symbolize the unity of France. There is speculation on the possible Crusader link that could bring these symbols from the Near East, for example, places like France. It's much less mechanicistic as an idea we can think. Like, it's not that the Westerners had to take these things from the outer side, but that there was possibly a functionalization as a fashion that even began to develop more in function of these contexts and different forms of military organization, not necessarily linked to the Crusades, but that were developing just in terms of cultural influence in parallel. And definitely for the eagle or the oak in the Cairo citadel, well, the bicephalic eagle, this universal symbol of power that dates back, in fact, to the same Egypt, to the same Persia, but that was used, as we know, by at least by the Byzantines, and the idea of the empire, right? And this look in the East and the West, all Holy Roman emperors would take, within a Christian context, but that was actually shared by many other peoples, right? And Saladin possibly did this even in competition with the Byzantines, and in that case there is a more likely possibility of actually Islamic mutation from Christianity, but that's also kind of anecdotal, because once again, these symbols were around there since millennia, and way even before the Roman Empire. So this is just speculation. It's most important what the political use at the time could be, and evidently the meaning here is quite clear, right? These symbols existed also, and obviously, in the steppes, right? So even with models of power, we're very far from this, largely, developed and territorialized sedentary empires, and so on. So the earliest firmly established rank is considered the feline motive of Al-Zahir Baybars, right? As you know, Baybars means Mamluk ruler's nickname, the Lord Panther, right? So feline symbolism is also to be found actually in the Turkic background. Here we are in the second half of the 13th century, and there are actually many more or even less identical examples of which are attested of the same on buildings, coins, and other objects. And from Baybar's time until the end of the Mamluk period, the ranks were gradually adopted by sultans and amirs, right, and perhaps other high officials. So this went in parallel actually to the gradual structuring of the Mamluk state as such, right? So this, in the Mamluk view, it was still a kind of an emanation from naturally the political and military rule, of which the state, even the bureaucracy, the non-properly military and the properly civilian cleric element was an emanation, right, and the head was shared by, right, and therefore in Egypt, and that's why we're talking about Egypt, right, we start seeing it carved on buildings, painted on glass, wood, pottery, engraved on metal work, struck on coins, and even embroidered or dyed on textiles. Interestingly, some evidence we have from this, from even the late Mamluk period up to even the beginning of the 16th century, is shown actually by Westerners that went there in diplomatic missions. They saw how the system was, and we have even certain beautiful paintings that show these Mamluk buildings with what look as very neatly defined emblems, very similar to our coat of arms, with these if you want more, ancestral symbolism than in Europe, right? As we were saying, in Europe, actually, feudalism had reached such a level of, of complexity and articulation and stratification that's when we start seeing something much more complicated. Think about the quartering of the various coat of arms, the superimpositions. I mean, you see many different symbols. In those that are displayed in this case seem much simpler, right? Like kind of unique figures that suggest a more central, a derivation from a more centralized system like the Mamluk one attempted and managed in many ways to be, compared especially to other Muslim powers around, right? But the profusion of material evidence about the ranks is not matched, right, by contemporary textual testimony. This is also very important. So the point here is, what was the symbolism actually related to in the political, the administrative, and even military practice? Meyer, this great scholar that made this impressive work in 1933, actually, and you can find it on archive.org for free, so it's very useful. It's several, it's hundreds of pages, and there are just lots of examples. Counted, as we were saying before, something like 50 references to the rank at a documentary level. It's absolutely not much, right? Today we have just some tens more than that. And the scarcity of such historical evidence led, especially the earlier studies, to consider the ranks in, at least similar ways to European heraldry proper, right? Today we tend to see them instead in a very different fashions. So, coming to the thing, the ranks had different shapes and forms. First of all, they weren't just about what they depicted, but even about a sort of categorization that went beyond that, and that therefore was not much centered on what was symbolized, but also by the fashion it was, in this case, properly framed in, right? Which suggests that a higher degree of centralization of the power that dispensed the symbols, as we will see, that didn't emerge, at least officially, institutionally, from the below, but were kind of given from the top. They could be either monochromatic or multicolored, right? Freestanding or enclosing round, pointed, or polygonal shields. And the first appeared as single element emblems, right? We have these horizontal strips called shafta in the sources that were introduced to the shields in the early 14th century, and in the 15th and early 16th century, the ranks developed into composite shields with 3 fields, right, and containing 1 sign or more. So even in here, you see, it's not like European heraldry. It's simpler, but it tends over time, just European heraldry, to grow more complex, more articulated, more subdivided, right? This has probably to do also with that decadence that Mamluk Egypt underwent towards, in fact, the second half of the 15th, the beginning of the 16th century. That highlighted also, the limits of a pre-modern state to centralize effectively, and that probably, parallels in the ranks something similar to European feudalism in this degree of privatization and decentralization, so that certain figures were recognized, were legitimized, even the sum of multiple symbols, or even their customization in a way based on their private power. Some So not all ranks had the same function, right? Some were, if you want to, representative, right? For example, the felines of Baibars, right? Which at that point are also kind of different from the other symbolism that is usually, I mean, animal symbolism is not so excessively frequent. There is the hawk, but other symbols are more stylized, actually. Baibars one is naturally more, evenly kind of military and similar to the Central Asian tradition. The chief panther, Baibars, in Kipchak Turkish, in fact, is the symbol of power and courage, right? That illustrates the name of the ruler in a quite personal, but also kind of terms of leadership, quite universally shared, especially in the Turkic world. And other ranks are instead more denotative, right? They display properly offices held by lesser figures such as the amirs. For example, Kabsun, who died in 1342, who started his career as a cupbearer, right? Saki, and this is, cupbearers are present basically in every empire that I can think. There is an office that had that function, and the rank displays, in fact, a cup, right? And still others combine more than one sign of office, as we were saying before, a sign and an image, such as the rank of Tukuts Tamur, died in 1345, which includes an eagle over a cup, right? So you understand that the symbolism here even goes, straight from a, an intuitive interpretation, in the sense that, what does that really mean? For example, in European heraldry, I think I've never seen an eagle surmounting a cup, or maybe there is, I don't know, probably there is something similar, but in here the thing is much more conceptual, right, and not merely emerging maybe from who knows which founding story that a certain secondary noble lineage in Europe wanted to portray in that regard. So it's evident that these ranks are much more codified than European codes of arms, and in fact the Sultan of Egypt initially assigned ranks to his newly appointed amirs himself, right, as symbols of their position at court properly. And for example, the rank of Davadar, that was the secretary, displayed or was proper, because even in here conceptually the rank is the picture that is represented rather than the emblem as such, was a pen box or an inkwell, right? And that of the Jamdar, that was the wardrobe master, was a lozenge. So this practice was surely not born with the Mamluks. Not even with the Ayyubids. There were earlier Islamic rulers who employed similar things. As we were saying before, from the Khwarezmians, we have the example of Muhammad Tekish, that ruled between 1200 and 1220, who is said to have honored his close pages with emblems, right, that however in the relative source are specifically designated by the Arabic term alama, right? And these emblems actually represented the pages' offices, right? Consider that the Khwarezmian rulers were in many ways the greatest collectors of the Aryan legacy of the steppe. We've seen it in that video on Islamic military music, where literally, the winged glory of the skies embodied itself in this greater drum that was played by the subject rulers of the Khwarezmians, that there was a very stratified hierarchy attached to such symbolism, and the fact that the practice of the ranks might have actually come from that we can say Persian Turkic area has a lot of meaning, right? Even in probably in models of leadership that were, in spite of the representation of the Sunni in Egypt, much more inspired in Mamluk world to this step dimension of the Turkic Persian world than rather the Arab legacy proper. Coming back to Egypt, in fact, amirs usually held their ranks for their entire careers, right? They were given this title and they maintained it. It was, these careers could be as short as, brutally ending, as you can imagine. The world system was fairly unstable, but still, the appointed figures were sometimes very important, and therefore their function was not, an easy one. At least, at some levels there was this disposability of naturally from the central power of the various offices, etc. But appointment, etc. But the point that were still very important figures that even threatened and competed with the same central power that, in the sense, had they were tied to the same through this legitimizing mean of the office and the attached rank. But even think about the tabla, right? This set of musical instruments that were of overwhelming importance in Islamic political and military culture, right? They really stressed the importance of the hierarchy. They were essentially of Persian traditions, the same traditions you find since the time of the Parthians, right? These peoples that, however, were now spread all over the Middle East and Near East in this, and even North Africa in this case. Midway, there's another scholar that studied the Mamluk period, shows that ranks appear to have become the choice of the individual Amir, right, irrespective of the insignia associated with his original office, which is actually the step before the composition of the ranks that we have seen occurring in the late Mamluk period, right? And this happened with this element from a fixed repertoire disposed in three strips, right? So this gradual composition that came to characterize in a more precise way something that evidently was actually breaking apart in its unity. This is the concept proper, and it looks more similar to this kind of failure of centralization, this attempt that the Mamluks had done, and that towards the late period instead starts, especially with the economy, especially manufacturing going worse, and central resources running out, is also partly the reason why the same Ottomans took over at some levels, but probably also because possibly the same feudal element, right, had never properly developed, right, in a more cohesive, like a set of lordships like you could find in Europe, right, that would have kept fighting even if the nominal central power of the sovereign would have crumbled from their respective assets. So Mayer noted that the composite ranks of a group of amirs who were Mamluks of a given sultan exhibited the same arrangement, right? So this was important because naturally there was a collective identity attributed to the ranks that sometimes was properly the one of the Mamluks, right, of the serfs themselves, and the royal ones, right, the sultan ones. This has a lot to do with many other aspects of the ranks proper, because this became also as a symbol of a unit, or to a belonging, or even of an ethnical group, right, because the Mamluks, as you know, were constantly substituted under the various rulers. This is a characteristic that we were actually even hinting at before about Islamic leadership, in the sense that this injection of slaves, they even take over as a kind of ruling class, and specifically a military class at some point that are over even the freedmen between the sultan and the locals in some ways. also in terms of status, were coming from all over Eurasia, right? There were people coming from everywhere. There were Slavs, there were Turks, there were Sudanese. I mean, they came from every freaking where, but they were mostly actually from the steppes, in the Caucasus, especially a lot, right? That's where slave trade actually occurred. So there was in the concept of the Mamluk slavery / serfdom actually a great honor and a great pride, right? Because these people sometimes began as actual slaves. I mean, people that were slaves of war that were sold to someone who, so some interpreter that trained them as soldiers and eventually sold them, or maybe even came at simply at his own command to conquer, to seize a place, to literally carve out its own space in society. Even we've seen it with the Wafidia, right? Troops, even that were framed under other commanders in armies that joined the Mamluk military, and didn't even pass through slavery, because let's be honest, many of these people were even kind of freelance mercenaries coming from the steppes, where maybe they didn't have like much of a status, but they could acquire one in Mamluk Egypt. So especially this bond of serfdom was very important, because the master, the Sultan in this case, even, so at the highest levels of Mamluk leadership, was considered like, you find it even among the Ottomans with the Janissaries, for example, as a father that had to take care of his children in this regard, and the Mamluks themselves were to be faithful, to be blindly faithful, but still they wanted something in return. So actually it was not a much of an asymmetric relation, right? It's not that these people were actually, full slaves, couldn't do anything. I mean, these people were dangerous, right? They needed to be rewarded in a way, and this was a clientelar system that naturally entailed very large and redistributive processes to keep this guys obedient. In fact, how the Mamluks were recycled in a way that they were given land at some point that could terminate their slavery, at least in a kind of a military sense, and become something like landed aristocracy. But at this point, this landed aristocracy at a local level created a problem, the one of decentralization, the same of this proto-feudal system of the Itka, and therefore other slaves were to be inserted once again in the game. So this was, and you understand that in the process, like a certain degree of centralization was built thanks to this, right? But at the same time, it doesn't seem like a particularly stable system, the one that needs actually external. Well, we can't even say that, because I was thinking about it. This sounds like at least people that come from the outside. But this actually was very common in other contexts. It's just that in Mamluk Egypt, it's brought to the, to the exponential that dimension compared to other societies, and that, however, depends on an outside source, right? It doesn't form a bond. That is able to sustain the leadership locally, right? It can happen because the same Mamluk system, as we've seen with land, really functions like this. But this is such a great system that basically it's brought together just by these new waves of slaves that are under the Sultan, that initially depend on them, that are, in the sense, more asymmetrical relations, and that eventually want to be rewarded because they are his army, right? So they can't even fight back. So actually, Mamluk politics is very complicated, but nevertheless very fascinating, and often overlooked and even misinterpreted in many ways. And this means that the ranks had, by late Mamluk times, become an indication of an affiliation with a royal household, in addition to begin a sign of office. Right, consider that towards the late Mamluk period were properly certain dynasties of amirs that became sultans themselves. So there was a competition at the local level in this regard, and therefore these amirs already owned, as we've seen, the ranks on their own. Who came to power, they kind of probably brought further customization to the sultanal rank based on their previous identity, and that transferred it in turn to this other, to their Mamluks, right, in the household. And in fact, this process overlaps exactly with the period that saw the Amirs ascending to the Mamluk hierarchy proper. The ranks of sultans were, however, different from the ones of the Amirs. Right? They were round, tripartite shields with the name, title, and a short motto. Right? Literally, some even pieces of poetry, singing the deeds, of the ruler, the victories, etc. They were inscribed, in fact, on one or two or even all of three the stripes. And this had become the norm already, actually, at the beginning of the 14th century, so very early, relatively early at least. However, they were not always used, right? For example, in the Burdi period that went between the 80s of the 14th century to 1517, actually the end of the Mamluk period, most sultans that were former amirs had, in fact, their own denotative ranks that they displayed alongside their inscribed shields, right? So here, as we were saying before, there is even the element of the local army brought besides one of the sultan's title, even when they became sultans themselves. And you understand once again why this became to approach in outline to European heraldry as well, because it was not anymore a general symbol, but it was transforming into something more private and fragmented. The main problem we have in general is that we do not understand what broader significance the ranks had in Mamluk society as a whole. And there are striking analogies, however, in many ways with the medieval European nobility, as sultans and amirs in the Mamluk Sultanate seem to have used their ranks both as decipherable codes and as signatures displayed on their buildings and objects, or on those they wanted to claim as their own. Right? However, the main difference with the coats of arms in Europe is that the ranks do not seem to have carried any heraldic potential as such. Because, importantly, and this is what we began from, there was no hereditary of this, right? There are very rare instances of sons of amirs who became amirs themselves, inheriting their father's ranks. But even at that point, such individuals did not acquire the offices or privileges they had originally pertained to their father's ranks, right? And we don't know why. Possibly because the structure of the Mamluk ruling class, whose members passed their power to recruit Mamluks rather than to their own sons, right? But this creates that detachment, in fact, between the institutional rank and the familial rank, right? As you see that the first one was attached to the office proper, the other was attached to the family in these rare cases, right? And the fact that there is a tendency in this regard is also meaningful. But still, the rank looked more than an instrument of personal legitimization, like within the European nobility, as a sort of display of power, right, of status in the measure to which the particular rank symbolized it, right? And the fact that an hereditary mechanism was absent is probably also the reason why the rank system disappeared after the Ottoman conquest of 1517, right? Otherwise, if these things had been kind of dynasties in the real sense, they would have lived on, right, with their own ranks. Instead, we do not have evidence of this specifically. I would just like to add that as far as we are concerned, it seems that the ranks, however, in general, were of too often not well distinguished ethnical differences, right? From one side we have the palace official symbolism, right, that might have pertained to other specific statal structures. From the other side, you see a more specific tribal and even more specific military legacy, right, that that is more reminiscent of the, especially also animal symbolism of, chiefly of the Turkic military of the steppes, right. We have interesting symbols, for examples like crossbows, crescents, even if some say that these were actually horse shows and not proper crescent. The crescent was used, but think about the Ottomans, kind of more famous, but even the Byzantines used that. It's a symbolism that existed in the Near East since Sumerian times, right? And all these powers were just, basically recycling it in its actually deep meanings that of course it had. But think about the prominence of the crescent in the Islamic world. And there are, sometimes we don't even know, in fact, what this is really about. There were sometimes even symbols of bows, interestingly enough, because you know that in the Islamic world and the Asian military culture in general, the bow has a greater importance than in Europe. Sometimes the bow even surpasses in certain cultures, specifically not these ones, but at least some steppes ones, the one of the sword as such, right? Maybe this is not so close to the times and spaces we're talking about, but we have symbols of bows, sometimes even crossbows, right? Albeit we do not have surviving examples of the latter. There are attached arrows to these bows, and we have also depictions of horns, and they were probably attached to the messengers, let's say to the diplomatic, let's say, body of the Mamluks in this sense, but that was, recalling older, more ancestral symbolism, kind of the horn in there of the steppe in many ways. We've seen these animals like the eagle, the hawk, that also come from, generally speaking, these military cultures. And there is, in fact, probably a much more interesting shared legacy here that we can see, like as we were saying at the beginning. The fleur de lis that we mentioned in this regard before, for example, was very similar in appearance to the one used in Frankish heraldry. However, with the difference that the tree leaves didn't grow from a common stem, right? While in fact in Frankish heraldry the leaves are individual, right, and they're joined together only by a band in the middle, right? And in general, we can see the legacy of the tamgas, the tribal symbols used as brands by many Asiatic peoples, right, introduced in the Near East, especially by the Turkish Mamluks proper. And this makes you understand that even these weren't just slaves, right, as we mean them. They're something different, right? Once again, when we talk about slavery as Mamluks, it's most like serfdom, and it has to do with conditions of semi-vassalage, right, in the sense of free military bands that decided to be installed, to be settled in some, chiefly even at the militarized frontier of the Mamluk world, the one of Syria, for example, that was in deep contact even with the, at some time with the Ilkhanate, as we have seen in the Wafidiyya video, and that was in fact in ever stronger contact with that Central Asian influence, right? As far as we can reconstruct about the colors, this heraldry consisted of white, yellow, red, blue, green, brown, black. I mean, all colors that, pretty standard worldwide in this sense. And yet we see that, for example, colors were not as regulated like in European heraldry, right, where certain colors were actually forbidden to be used together, right? This at least doesn't seem to have existed in this Muslim context. And once again, we have news about the existence of the proper ranks that are called like that within other peoples, in tribal ones like the Bedouins of North Africa. That were definitely in intense contact with Mamluk Egypt, were influenced by it, at least before the fall to the Ottomans. Egypt was the most influential power there, and therefore we can't see, and there is surely much more to research on this topic, and it would be very, very interesting to see a PhD, for example, written on this topic. And for now I would stop it here. Right, I don't think there is. There would be a lot to add. Go look on archive.org about Meyer's book. Right, it is very analytical in a way that, but it's still basically most of what we know. Right, aside from these interpretations that we've tried to outline, but the evidence is there, and we mostly don't understand much still about the whole thing. So that's why we were wishing for someone maybe to explore this field in the future. So for now we stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.